Before there was America, there was survival. It is November 1620. The Atlantic Ocean is black and furious. A wooden ship, barely 100 feet long, is being swallowed by 30-foot waves. Inside, 102 terrified men, women, and children cling to each other in the dark. They have been at sea for 66 days. Their food is rotting. Their bodies are breaking. 2 people have died, and they have no idea what is waiting for them on the other side. What happens next will become the founding myth of an entire civilization. Chapter 1. The desperate men who dared to leave to understand the miracle of the first Thanksgiving. You first have to understand just how desperate these people were, and how remarkable it is that any of them survived at all. They were not adventurers. They were not soldiers of fortune-seeking gold. Most of them were ordinary farmers, cobblers, weavers, and servants from the English countryside. People who had been ground down by decades of religious persecution. A small group among them, the separatists, later called Pilgrims, believed that the Church of England had become hopelessly corrupt. They wanted to worship God in their own way, on their own terms. For this simple belief, they had been hunted, imprisoned, and fined into poverty. In 1608, they had already fled once to the Netherlands, a more tolerant country. But after 12 years in Leiden, Holland, they were growing old. Their children were forgetting their English language and customs, and they feared losing everything that made them who they were. The solution was radical, audacious, and frankly terrifying. They would sail to the New World and start over from nothing. Did you know? Only about 37 of the 102 passengers aboard the Mayflower were actual separatist pilgrims. The rest, called strangers by the Pilgrims, were merchants, hired workers, and servants recruited by the investors who funded the voyage. They didn't always get along. They secured a deal with the Virginia Company of London, who agreed to fund the voyage in exchange for 7 years of labor in the colony. 2 ships were prepared, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. But the Speedwell, true to its unfortunate name, leaked so badly it had to turn back twice. All 102 passengers were crammed onto the Mayflower alone, a merchant vessel that had previously hauled wine barrels across the channel. It was not built for this kind of journey. It was not built for these kinds of people. And the sea waiting for them was not interested in mercy. Chapter 266 Days of Hell on the Atlantic. The Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England on September 6, 1620. What followed was a voyage that modern historians describe as a miracle of human endurance. The passengers slept, if you could call it sleeping, in a between-deck space less than 5 feet high. They could not stand upright. They could not light fires for warmth. They could not go on deck during storms, which came relentlessly. They survived on hard biscuits, dried meat, dried fish, and salted butter. When the Atlantic turned on them, the waves hit so hard that a main beam cracked. The crew wanted to turn back. The passengers refused. A passenger named John Howland was swept overboard in a storm and grabbed a trailing rope, hauling himself back aboard. He would survive to father 10 children and 88 grandchildren, and today an estimated 2 million Americans count him as an ancestor. A birth on the Mayflower during the crossing, a baby was born in the heaving darkness of the ship's hold. His parents, Elizabeth and Stephen Hopkins, named him Oceanus in honor of the ocean that was trying to kill them all. Another baby, Peregrine White, was born after the ship arrived in New World waters, making him the first English child born in New England. Only one person died during the crossing, a young crewman whose name history never recorded. One passenger, William Button, a servant, died just days before they arrived. By contrast, the ship's doctor did almost nothing useful. Because no one truly understood disease in 1620, they survived mostly by luck, stubbornness, and prayer. On November 9, 1620, after 66 days at sea, a lookout spotted land. They had arrived, but not where they intended. They were supposed to go to northern Virginia. Instead, they had been blown far off course to the hook of land that juts into the Atlantic like a bent arm, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. They tried to sail south to their original destination, but encountered dangerous shoals and turned back. Cape Cod it would be. A new world. An unknown world. And winter was already here. They knew they were pilgrims. William Bradford, describing the moment they lost sight of England, using the word that would name them forever. Chapter 3. The Mayflower Compact. Democracy born on a ship before a single foot touched American soil. Something extraordinary happened aboard the Mayflower that would echo through 4 centuries of history. When it became clear they were landing outside their original territory, the strangers, the non-pilgrim passengers, declared that since they were outside the boundaries of their charter, They owed no obedience to anyone. They would go their own way. It threatened to tear the fragile community apart before it had even begun. The Pilgrim leaders acted fast. On November 11, 1620, still anchored in Provincetown Harbor, 41 of the male passengers gathered and signed a document that would become one of the most important political texts in American history, the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact, America's first democratic agreement. Written in just a few hours, the compact established that the colonists would form a civil body politic, a self-governing community where laws would be made for the general good of the colony. It was not perfect. Women couldn't sign. Servants couldn't sign. But for 1620, it was revolutionary. The idea that a group of ordinary people could create their own government answerable to no king by simple mutual agreement. John Carver was elected the first governor. They were officially a society. Now they just had to survive long enough to be one. Chapter 4. The first winter, death came on silent feet. Nothing in their English countryside upbringing had prepared them for a New England winter. And the winter of 1620 to 1621 was a brutal, unforgiving one. They had arrived too late to plant crops. They had no shelter beyond the ship. Scouting parties went ashore daily in the bitter cold to find a place to settle, returning frostbitten and exhausted. They chose a location, a cleared area the local Wampanoag people called Patuxent, which the English maps labeled Plymouth because of its good harbor, fresh water spring, and fields that had already been cleared. They didn't know then why those fields were cleared, why the land seemed strangely empty. They would learn soon enough. The dying began almost immediately. Packed together in the damp hold of the Mayflower, weakened from months at sea, exposed to brutal cold whenever they went ashore, they fell to a mysterious illness, likely a combination of pneumonia, scurvy, and what some historians believe may have been a deadly infection called leptospirosis. The sick lay next to each other in the dark. The healthy tried to care for them and fell sick themselves. The terrible toll. By spring of 1621, only 53 of the original 102 passengers were still alive. Among the dead, Governor John Carver's wife and virtually all of the colony's women. 13 of the 18 adult women died that winter. The children survived at slightly higher rates. Of the 18 adult men who signed the Mayflower Compact, only half lived to see summer. The survivors made a grim, silent decision. They buried their dead on Coles Hill at night in unmarked graves, smoothing the soil over them so no watching eyes, and there were watching eyes, could see how few of them remained. They planted crops over the graves. They could not afford to appear weak because they were being watched. The Wampanoag had seen them come, and the Wampanoag had a reason, rooted in recent terrible history, to be very cautious about what to do next. Chapter 5. Squanto, the most astonishing figure in American history. On March 16, 1621, a man walked into Plymouth Colony and said in clear English, "Welcome." His name was Samoset, an Abenaki Sagamore from Maine who had picked up English from fishing traders. He stayed the night, ate their food, and told them about the local people, the Wampanoag, and their sachem, chief, Massasoit. He said he would bring someone who spoke even better English. That someone changed American history more profoundly than almost anyone knows. His name was Squanto. The English called him Squanto. And his life story is so extraordinary, so harrowing, so improbable, that if you wrote it as fiction, no one would believe it. Squanto was a Patuxent Wampanoag, born near the very land where the Pilgrims had landed. In 1614, he was kidnapped by an English sea captain named Thomas Hunt, who seized him and over 20 other native men and sailed them to Malaga, Spain, where he tried to sell them into slavery. Squanto escaped, or was rescued by local friars, made his way to England, lived in London, learned fluent English, and eventually found passage back to North America in 1619. He returned home to find his entire village, every man, woman, and child, dead. An epidemic, likely brought by earlier European contact, had swept through the region just before the Pilgrims arrived. What had once been a thriving community of thousands was now empty fields and silent bones. Why the fields were clear. The Pilgrims had marveled at the cleared fields near Plymouth. They seemed like a gift, farmland already prepared. It was, in the most heartbreaking sense, exactly that. The Patuxent people who had lived and farmed there were gone, killed by epidemic between 1616 and 1619. An estimated 90% of the coastal New England native population died in those 3 years. The Pilgrims had, unknowingly, settled a graveyard. Squanto had nowhere to go and no people to return to. When Massasoit and Samoset brought him to meet the Pilgrims, something remarkable happened. Squanto decided to stay and help them. He taught them to plant corn the native way, fertilizing each mound with a small fish, Udri pirang or alewife, to enrich the thin New England soil. He showed them where to fish and how to catch eels. He taught them which plants were edible and which were poisonous. He served as interpreter and diplomat between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. Without Squanto, the simplest and most honest assessment is the Plymouth colony would not have survived its first year. Why did he do it? Historians have debated this for generations. Some believe he saw an opportunity to gain power and influence by positioning himself as an indispensable middleman. Others believe he genuinely found community with these struggling strangers in a land that had become for him a place of ghosts. Perhaps both are true. Whatever his reasons, Squanto became one of the most consequential figures in early American history, a man who, despite everything that had been done to him by English people, chose to teach English people how to survive. Squanto was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. William Bradford, Governor of Plymouth Colony. Chapter 6. Massasoit and the peace that held for 50 years. On March 22, 1621, Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag Confederation, walked into Plymouth with 60 warriors at his back. The Pilgrims, numbering barely 50 and still weak from winter, met him with as much dignity as they could muster, beating drums, blowing a trumpet, and presenting him with gifts of food and drink. What followed was a treaty, negotiated through Squanto, that would hold for 50 years. It was a remarkable document for its time. Both sides agreed to keep the peace, to aid each other if attacked, to return stolen goods and punish those who broke the peace. Massasoit and his people had their own reasons for wanting this alliance. The epidemic had devastated the Wampanoag, and rival tribes, particularly the Narragansett, had been pressing in on their weakened territory. The English, with their guns and their ships, represented a potential counterbalance to these threats. A strategic alliance, Massasoit's decision to ally with the Pilgrims, was a calculated political move, not simple generosity. The Wampanoag Confederation had been seriously weakened by disease and needed allies. For 50 years, this gamble held. The peace between Plymouth and the Wampanoag lasted longer than almost any agreement between native peoples and European colonists in the entire history of North America. Through the spring and summer of 1621, under Squanto's guidance, the colony grew. They planted 20 acres of corn, 6 acres of barley and peas. They built houses, they learned to trade, they buried fewer people. The warmth came back to New England, and with it, something the survivors had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Chapter 7. The Harvest, the Feast, and what actually happened in the autumn of 1621. The harvest came in. It was not enormous, the barley and peas had largely failed, but the corn was good, and the colony had survived. Governor William Bradford declared a time of celebration and thanksgiving. He sent 4 men out fowling to shoot birds for the feast. They came back loaded. Word was sent to Massasoit. What happened next is one of the most famous events in American history, and also one of the most persistently misunderstood. Massasoit didn't just send a polite reply accepting the invitation. He showed up with 90 warriors. 90! The entire Pilgrim colony at that point numbered barely 50 men, women, and children combined. Suddenly, the hosts were dramatically outnumbered by their guests. The feast lasted 3 days. 3 days of eating, games, and military demonstrations. The Wampanoag men went out and hunted 5 deer, which they contributed to the feast. They had brought enough food to feed themselves, and then some. This was not a charity meal from the Pilgrims to the native people. This was a shared celebration between 2 peoples who had, against all odds, managed to build something like trust. What was actually on the table almost certainly not turkey, though there may have been wildfowl of some kind, possibly ducks, geese, or passenger pigeons. The menu almost certainly included venison, deer, corn in various forms, shellfish, oysters, clams, lobster, fish, likely cod and bass, wild plums and berries, beans, squash, and possibly a grain porridge. Cranberry sauce, as we know it, wouldn't exist for another 50 years. The Pilgrims had no sugar to make it. Pumpkin pie did not exist either. They may have cooked pumpkin, but the butter and wheat flour for proper pastry weren't available. The first Thanksgiving was far more of a seaside harvest festival than the candlelight dinner of modern imagination. We know about this gathering from only 2 surviving first-hand accounts, a letter by colonist Edward Winslow and a later account by Governor William Bradford in his memoir of Plymouth Plantation. Neither account mentions the word Thanksgiving. Neither mentions turkey. Neither describes a formal seated dinner. What they describe is something rawer and more joyful, survivors feasting in the open air, a fragile peace holding, and two very different peoples finding, briefly, common ground. Chapter 8. The Second Winter, the Supply Ship, and the Bitter Truth. If the first Thanksgiving was the high point, what came immediately after brought the colonists crashing back to Earth. In November 1621, just weeks after the harvest feast, a ship arrived from England. The Fortune Shrive, small, barely seaworthy, brought 37 more passengers. New mouths to feed with almost no supplies, the colonists, who had barely enough for themselves through the coming winter, now faced starvation again. Bradford reduced everyone's rations by half. The second winter was brutal, hungry, and dark. The brief, disastrous experiment with communism. Under their original agreement with the investors, the colonists were supposed to hold all land and produce in common, a kind of forced communal arrangement. Bradford later wrote that this destroyed motivation. Strong men resented working for others' benefit, and women refused to cook for men who weren't their husbands. In 1623, Bradford made a revolutionary decision. He assigned each family their own land to farm for their own benefit. Productivity soared immediately. Bradford attributed the transformation to human nature and private ownership, a lesson that has been cited by free market economists ever since. But the colony ground forward. More ships came, more settlers arrived. The compact held. Massasoit's alliance held. Squanto, who had navigated years of impossible circumstances with extraordinary skill, died in the autumn of 1622, most likely of a European disease, before he could see the colony he had saved grow into permanence. Bradford wept. Chapter 9. How a Day of Survival became a national holiday for most of the next 2 centuries. Thanksgiving was observed irregularly across the colonies as a religious day of prayer and gratitude, usually called when there was something specific to be grateful for, like a good harvest, the end of a drought, or a military victory. It was never formally the Plymouth Harvest Feast specifically. The transformation began with a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of a women's magazine called Godey's Lady's Book, and the author of Mary Had a Little Lamb. For decades, Hale campaigned tirelessly for a national, unified Thanksgiving Day, writing letters to governors and presidents year after year. 5 presidents ignored her. The 6th, Abraham Lincoln, did not. On October 3, 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, after the Union victory at Gettysburg, Lincoln declared the last Thursday of November a national day of thanksgiving and praise to our national day of place to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. It was a deliberate act of national unity, an attempt to give a fractured, bleeding nation a common ritual of gratitude to hold on to. When FDR moved Thanksgiving, and America erupted in 1939, Franklin D. Roosevelt controversially moved Thanksgiving up 1 week earlier to extend the Christmas shopping season and boost the Depression-era economy. Half the country refused to comply. Some states observed the original date, some the new one, and some states celebrated both, calling them Franksgiving and Republican Thanksgiving. Congress settled the matter in 1941 by formally fixing Thanksgiving as the 4th Thursday of November, where it has remained ever since. The connection to the Pilgrims specifically was cemented gradually through the 19th century through schoolbooks, paintings, and the romantic mythology that Americans built around their own origins. The specific image of pilgrims in black hats and buckles sitting down with Native Americans for a shared meal became a national symbol of gratitude, community, and survival. Like all national myths, it simplified a far more complex and painful story. Chapter 10. The full story, legacy, complexity, and what we choose to remember. The story of the first Thanksgiving is genuinely extraordinary. A story of desperate, courageous people who crossed an ocean on a ship barely bigger than a city bus, survived a winter that killed half of them, and built the foundations of what would become the world's most powerful democracy. That part of the story is real, and it deserves to be told with wonder. But the full story is also more complicated and more human than the myth suggests. The peace between Plymouth and the Wampanoag did not last forever. Massasoit died in 1661. His son, known to the English as King Philip, watched as more and more English settlers arrived, taking more and more English settlers arrived, taking more and more land, breaking more and more agreements. In 1675, he led a desperate uprising against the English colonists. King Philip's War, that became, proportionally, one of the deadliest conflicts in American history. When it ended in 1676, King Philip's head was mounted on a pike in Plymouth, where it remained for 25 years. a day of mourning. Since 1970, a group of Native Americans and their supporters have gathered at Plymouth Rock on Thanksgiving Day for the National Day of Mourning, a solemn counter-ceremony recognizing the suffering, dispossession, and cultural destruction that followed European colonization. Both narratives, gratitude and grief, are part of the same history. None of this erases what happened in the autumn of 1621. It doesn't make the Pilgrims' courage smaller, or their suffering less real, or Squanto's generosity less profound. It makes the story more true. History is rarely a clean parable. The first Thanksgiving was a moment of genuine connection between people who had every reason not to trust each other and who chose briefly something better. That is worth remembering. That is worth honoring. And the full story. All of it. The survival and the suffering, the gratitude and the grief, the extraordinary people on all sides of that autumn feast is worth knowing.